On this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast, I interview Paul Hetherington from Buglife. In this episode, we talk about the importance of insects and other invertebrates, not only for the global ecosystem but also for the global economy. We talk about the threats faced by invertebrates across the world and what Buglife is doing to conserve these critical species. Tune in to listen more. And don't forget to share and subscribe to the Think Wildlife podcast. Welcome to our podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. First question is, why are insects so important for not only the ecosystem but for humans as well?
So a really good question. And the reality is that life as we know it would not be possible without bugs. Just take one type of bug for starters, like pollinators. Now, without pollinators, roughly 1 in every 3 mouthfuls that we eat would no longer be produced. And it's things like, well, the obvious things are things like fruit and tomatoes and peas and beans and cucumbers and marrows. But then when you look into it, you realize there'd be no carrots or parsnips and things like that either, because they will not set seed without a pollinator to enable seed to be set. So yes, you eat the root, but you wouldn't have new seeds, so you'd have no new crop of them. So we'd be left with grains, rices, things like potatoes that you can reproduce by replanting the tubers. But as you can see, there's not a lot of variety or colour in that as a basic diet. Then, of course, there's the matter of wildflowers, and we would lose 8 out of every 10 of the wildflowers that we enjoy in the countryside at the moment. So just taking out one small group, pollinators, would have a profound effect on life as we know it. Now, taking a look at some of the other fantastic services that invertebrates provide makes you realize just how different the world would be. Things like dung beetles and, of course, flies are responsible for breaking down feces. And without that being broken down, imagine what it'd be like going out your door if none of the poo that had ever been put on the planet had ever been chomped up and turned back into goodness in the soil. And also imagine how poor the soil would be now to grow things in if there weren't all those little bugs down there in the soil that take and break down dead vegetation, dead animals, and of course poo, and turn it into fertile soil. Then, you know, there are all sorts of other activities they do. They provide food for larger creatures. In the UK, for instance, if we had no invertebrates, you would have 2 species of bird left, and that would be it. One of them is a seed eater that eats the seed of grasses, so you'd have that. And the other thing you'd have is you'd have some sort of carrion bird of prey that could eat on things like dead rabbits, because you'd still have rabbits because they eat grass, and grass would be here without the pollinators. But the world would be so different, and life as we know it would be extremely hard to maintain. Also bear in mind, when it comes to high protein foods, the most consumed in terms of weight high protein food is scampi, which again comes from an invertebrate, from the lobster family. So a very, very different world it would be if we lost all of our invertebrates, and probably not a world we could continue living in.
How does light pollution impact these insects?
Now, light pollution is a very insidious problem, and it's probably the last, acceptable form of pollution as far as humans are concerned, because we're all frightened of the dark and what might be lurking in the dark. Although, of course, it's by shining a light on somewhere that you also create the shadow in which danger can lurk. But light has a terrible effect on insects. It is estimated that 1 in every 3 insects that's impacted by ALAN, that's the short for artificial light at night, but I just love calling it ALAN, will die as a direct consequence to that interaction, either because it bashes into something, which kills it, or it lands on something that's really hot, like old-fashioned lights were really, really hot and burns up, or it becomes disorientated and is therefore easy prey to something like bats or indeed birds. So it has a terrible impact on them. And of course, our modern movement to these diode-based lights has been great for reducing energy output, but it has had negative consequences for wildlife in total, because most of these modern lights are far brighter, so we're putting far more brightness out there, and also they're very much at the white light end of the spectrum, so they've got all the colors in them. Whereas you look back at older style lighting, you tended to have things like sodium street lamps, and they were orange yellow spectrum, and light in the orange to yellow spectrum has less impact on invertebrates than going towards the blue end, so where you get once you've got the white light out there. So that switch has also had a very negative impact. It's been good for energy, but bad for biodiversity. And we've been doing a lot of work with places looking at this, and the fact that you can actually reduce the luminescence now you bring in this stuff, and that will also save businesses further money and have less of an impact on wildlife. And then the other thing is about being smart with your lighting, so making sure that it is directional, you're only lighting what you need to light up, and also that it's only on when you need it. So it's things like motion triggered sensors which will bring the lights on in the area, but only for that time while they're needed. And likewise, it's for us as individuals to think, oh, I've got the lights on in the house, let's draw the curtains or the blinds to make sure my light's not spilling outside, or I've got outside lights on, well, let's make sure that they turn off when I don't need them out there rather than being on permanently.
And what's the impact of climate change on insects?
Climate change is also having quite a negative impact on insects, particularly because it's allied to the fact that we've lost that connectivity between places that they live, and a lot of insects are now finding it too warm in the areas they are. Take bumblebees, for instance. If you go down to areas like the Mediterranean, there are 2 species. In the UK, we've got 25 species. In France, you've got 47. And that's because they're a species that like a temperate climate. And naturally, they would want to start moving north as things get really hot. I mean, last summer in the UK was a typical example of extreme heat, and that would have been really bad for bumblebees. And anyone who was out and about noticing will have seen that their activity was now very early in the morning and in the sort of late evening when it was cooler, because they just couldn't get out and about at midday. But of course, flowers are starting to close up at that time, so food is scarce. And also a lot of reports of just whole nests that died out because it just got too hot for them. Similar impact on wasps, in fact. So I say they would like to move northwards, but because the connectivity has been lost, they can't. A lot of our rarest bumblebee species are only found in the cairngorms now, but some of the other really rare ones are down in areas of the southeast. A lot of them are actually on brownfield sites around London. And of course, they're completely cut off. They can't move north to escape climate change. Looking at river flies is another really good way of measuring how climate change is already heavily impacting. So in the last 5 years, we have noticed that various species of river fly, when you go looking for the larvae in the river, have moved 1 mile upstream. And that is just the micro change in the temperature of the water in the stream has caused that to happen. But by extrapolating that, if something doesn't happen in 20 years' time, we will probably only find a lot of the river flies that are common across the whole of the UK now in very high upland places like the cairngorms in Scotland, because all of the lowland areas, the streams, even the top end of the streams, are going to be too hot for them to reproduce. And that's going to have a massive impact because, of course, they are a huge amount of food supply for fish and for birds, particularly at the time when things like mayflies will come out and swarm and die within 24 hours. It's a huge bumper feeding time at a time when things like birds are breeding. So massive impact beyond just invertebrates that this climate change will have. And I suppose the other way climate change impacts is it is allowing non-native species to start establishing themselves in countries, and those non-native species can have very detrimental effects. Some of them can be sort of apex predators that will wipe out some of our native species, and quite often they are species that there is nothing that will predate in the country that they've moved to. A classic example of that is something like the chestnut leaf miner, which is what makes chestnut, as in conker trees, get that horrible brown colouring in their leaves fairly early in the year, from perhaps June onwards, looking like the leaves are dying. And that's chestnut leaf miners, or the Macedonian moth as it's also known. And that came to the UK in the sort of late about 2008, 2009, and it's now spread across the whole of the country. And of course, those trees are also non-native to this country. They came like them off from the sort of Macedonia area. But the thing is, down there is things that can predate it. Here, there isn't. It lives between the layers of the tree. And so it's having a massive impact on chestnut trees. But also, as well as bringing in things that are destroying things because there's nothing that can control them, we're also bringing in things that are bringing diseases that have a negative impact. So a classic example of that would be the signal crayfish that came into this country, and it carries crayfish plague. It carries it but isn't affected by it. The native white-clawed crayfish, you put one signal crayfish into a water system that the white claw is in, and within a year they will all die from this plague. Very similar to the impact grey squirrels had on red squirrels when they were introduced and bringing in squirrel pox. So climate change has got a very big negative impact. Again, particularly allied to the fact that the native species are no longer able to migrate. They can't get away to find new places to be.
Another important threat to insects are pesticides and fertilizers. Could you just elaborate on how exactly these are impacting invertebrates and what can be done to minimize their impacts?
So yeah, pesticides, herbicides, and over putting nutrition into the ground have also got really negative impacts on invertebrates. Pesticides, fairly obvious really what the problem is. It kills them. And unfortunately, pesticides are not so selective that they will only kill what you consider to be the pests. They also kill the beneficial insects. So lots of people used to put out things to kill slugs with, but that was also killing the beetles that eat the slugs, and it was killing the hedgehogs that eat the slugs, and the frogs and the toads that eat the slugs, and indeed also killing some domestic animals like cats and things that ate the hedgehogs or the toads that had eaten the slugs that were poisoned. So we were poisoning huge tranches of the whole food chain to try and deal with an issue. Whereas if what we'd done was try and encourage some of our more predatory things like building banks for beetles, you would have got to this situation. Yeah, there'd still be some slugs about, obviously, but there wouldn't be so many that they would destroy a crop. And similar problems with pesticides, particularly there was a movement to go away from just spraying the areas with pesticides to actually creating seeds that are impregnated with pesticides, and the plant grows up and the plant's got the pesticide within it. And this was done on a lot of things that are very attractive to pollinators, such as rape. And they come in to pollinate the flowers and they're picking up this poison. But also alongside that, when the seed is sown, if you've ever seen the seeds being sown, there's this like white dust goes everywhere, and that is the pesticide, and it went into the hedgerows and into neighbouring flowering areas. So you've got this area that looks, I'm a buffet, come in and get me, to all the pollinators. And, oh yeah, this looks nice, and they come down to it, but it's actually laced with poison that it's in many cases deadly, but even when it isn't deadly, it has very negative impact. So there is strong evidence to prove that it reduces the number of new queens that are produced from a bee colony, for instance. And it also makes things like bees far more susceptible to other illnesses. And of course, once it's got there, it's in the soil and it leaches into the water system. So it will be wiping out invertebrates in our fresh water areas. And most of these pesticides have at least a 2-year half-life. So even if you stop using it, it's going to be there in a fair amount of concentration within your soil and your water for a considerable amount of time. Herbicides, well, what herbicides do is, often people talk about England's green and pleasant land. I think it's in a song, isn't it? But the thing is, if you actually look at it, it is a green land, but it's not all that pleasant, because in most of the places it's monoculture agriculture, because the herbicides are used, they are more selective. Basically, they take out all the flowers, and you've got a field full of wheat, and you can buy these packs of what are called cornfield annuals, and these are all these pretty flowers that used to grow in wheat fields. But you very seldom see flowers in wheat fields anymore because the use of pesticides has wiped them out. So you're effectively creating areas that have got absolutely no food for invertebrates in them whatsoever, because there's no flowers there, which is again fueling the declines, and again putting barriers between them, getting between places where it is good for them. And then of course fertilizers into areas are really, really bad as well when you get the high concentrations of them, because it encourages vigorous growth of things like grasses. And if you get vigorous growth of the grasses, it suppresses the wildflowers. So a similar effect really to putting the herbicide on, you are losing that florid food supply for your pollinators as a result of getting too much vigor in your grass growth. And also it causes overgrowth of weedy plants within water systems that cut off the sunlight getting into water systems and often drain the water system of oxygen, which again makes it an inhospitable climate for, well, not just for bugs but for fish as well. So it's all a pernicious, vicious circle, really, unfortunately.
What are some other threats faced by invertebrates?
So the other big threat is this loss of habitat, and alongside that, the loss of connectivity between the habitat. So, for instance, in the UK, well, in England and Wales, we have lost 97% of our wildflower-rich grassland since the late 1930s. Now, to put that a bit more in perspective, that's an landmass equivalent to about 1.5 times the size of Wales. So it's a huge amount of land that's been lost. If you've lost that much habitat, you're obviously going to have a major impact on populations. Allied to that is the fact that what you end up with is very fragmented populations. So you might have this big area that's really good for pollinators still, but the next area that will support them is beyond the traveling distance of the pollinators. And that then means if something happens to one of those areas, you will lose everything because it can't migrate, it can't get anywhere. And that's something that happens. It could be a natural disaster like flooding. And of course, this is another impact of climate change, really. We're getting extremes of weather, so you're starting to get places flood more often. Or a wildfire, which again, climate change is leading to more wildfires happening. Or it could be human intervention, like we decide we're going to build a road in this place, or an airport, or some industrial units. And of course, a lot of the really important sites for invertebrates in the country now are some of these brownfield sites in areas like the Thames Gateway. And they are prime building sites and very, very valuable land for building on. So it's a really real threat that these sites are starting to disappear. And when they disappear, the invertebrates can't get to the next place that will support them. So you're wiping out the entire populations. So it's a vicious circle of all of these factors adding up together, and the lack of connectivity, meaning that every time one of these things happen, you're losing everything there. So it's vastly accelerating the declines.
Spoke about brownfield sites. So what are you doing at Buglife to conserve these habitats?
So we're doing quite a lot of things at Buglife around this, and brownfield sites, we're one of the few charities that work on conservation that really value brownfield sites, and we fought a number of planning battles to save brownfield sites. We co-managed the site at Canvey Island called Canvey Wick, which is a brownfield site. It was prepared to be an oil refinery originally that never got built, but all the footings and things were put in there. And it's a really great habitat for invertebrates, and it's now protected as a SSSI and a nature reserve. We've recently been fighting a battle to save Swanscombe Marshes, which in the words of Natural England is the best site for invertebrates in the whole of England. And they wanted to build a Disney type park on that whole site and destroy it. And that site has around about 250 what we would call red listed species, so highly endangered invertebrates, including things like the distinguished jumping spider, where it's one of only 2 sites in the whole of the UK where that species exists. We fought a similar battle to try and save West Thurrock Marshes, and in the end a small little section of that was preserved, and that happens to be the other place that the distinguished jumping spider lives. So we do a lot of fighting to save these sites. Where possible, we will come in and help manage those sites to keep them going. And we campaign about the importance of these sites. And we have also done some work where we've helped create effectively new brownfield sites as part of living roofs on the tops of buildings, such as the University of East London. We've created some living roofs up there that are mimicking brownfield sites, and that's for species such as the streaked bombardier beetle that has been moved onto there, so that it's got a kind of arc site to keep that alive in the country.
Could you elaborate a bit on your living roof project?
Yeah, so we have lots of flat roof spaces nowadays, and particularly in our urban environment, we have very little habitat available for wildlife, and living roofs is one of the great ways of doing it. But we've done a lot of research into what are the optimal things to have on a living roof to make sure that it's good for invertebrates, and if it's good for invertebrates, it's going to be good for wildlife. And looking at the substrates, and we've got a whole list of what you need to do. We've also worked on a number of sites. Probably the most high profile was the Victoria and Albert Museum, where we've created a couple of living roofs right on the top of the museum that are supporting a wide range of invertebrates. And it's amazing what you'll end up there. On one of those two living roofs we built up there, we've created a wetland living roof, so it's got a pond with it. And there are creatures that we went up when we surveyed it recently that cannot fly, that have got up onto the roof of the Victoria and Albert Museum and are now living in that pond. So basically they must have hitched a lift on a bird or something to get there. But you create these sites and you will get things living there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge expanse. Bus shelters are great places for living roofs, bike sheds, particularly when you're building from scratch. Think about putting something like that on there, because to support a living roof you do need a good solid roof structure. Retrofitting them is difficult. Including them when you're doing a new build or building something from scratch is actually very simple and doesn't really add to the cost of a building whatsoever. So living roofs are really, really important sites, particularly in our urban areas, for creating that habitat and also for creating those corridors that will enable things to move from one good habitat to another one.
One more project being run by Buglife is the Beeline project. Could you just elaborate on this project as well?
Now, the Beelines project is a really critical project, really, for invertebrate survival. And basically what it is, it's about putting that connectivity back there. And what we've done is we've mapped the key sites for particularly pollinators within the whole of the UK. And we have then looked at how you could connect them up. And we've mapped the whole of the UK now with these routes, which we call insect superhighways, which will connect up these key sites. Now, it doesn't connect all of them up. We couldn't manage that. But basically, each county has got a north, south, and an east, west line across it. I say basically because some counties are too small for two lines and some are too big just for the two lines. And they're not straight lines. They wiggle around. They often follow river valleys or railway routes or even road routes, because they follow natural gaps through areas. And they join up as many of these key sites as possible. And the idea is now to complete that connectivity by creating as much wildflower rich habitat within those spaces. Now, we call them insect superhighways, but where they're different from a road, if you like. If I'm building a road and I come to a gap where it stops, my car stops, I can't carry on. Insects can fly. So although we call them superhighways, they're really stepping stones. And as long as you fill in about a tenth of the beeline with these stepping stones, they will start to function. The more you fill it in, the better it will function. And the rationale behind this is, yes, it's good for anyone anywhere to do stuff to help pollinators and help bugs. But if we were to just randomly do stuff all over the country, you would need to create 10 times the area of really good habitat that you would if you concentrated it on the Beelines project. So that's why it's such an important flagship, and it's recently been adopted by the European Union. They're calling them buzz lines, and they're now going to map the whole of continental Europe with these connecting lines. So, you know, it's been seen as something that really works and something that's really important to do on a global level.
Could you just talk about some of the other campaigns being run by Buglife?
So yeah, we work on all invertebrates. That's a huge area. So we do a lot of peat bog restoration in Scotland, for instance, because peat bog is a really important habitat for a lot of very rare invertebrates. And we also do a lot of work with species that are particularly at risk of extinction. And a classic example of that would be the iconic ladybird spider, which when we started work on it, was found on one small site in the Dorset Heaths, which was not much larger than a tennis court. and there were roughly 100 of those spiders left in the whole of the UK. Now, it had never been a common species, but it had originally been something you would find anywhere between the New Forest and Land's End on those sort of heathland areas. And what we've done over just over 10 years of working on it, we have done some captive breeding of the spiders. We have done some translocation of spiders to sites that have been prepared to be good receptor sites for them. And I'm pleased to say that the spider is now established on 19 sites on this sort of heathland area in southern England. And we now feel it's got a sustainable population. And just as well, really, because the other year there was a fire down near Wareham, and it took out around about a third of the original site. And if all of that translocation and activity hadn't happened, that would be really endangering the future of that species. And of course, it could have burnt the whole site and wiped out the species. So that's why it's so important to do that sort of work. And there's lots of other species we're doing similar activities with. We've got a big project just starting up in Scotland called Species on the Edge, which is looking at some of the really rare species there, one of which actually is the medicinal leech. And it seems weird that that is now a rare species when you consider, not that many years ago, medicinal leeches were used massively in medicine for treating people. And now it's really, really rare and confined to just a few sites up in northern Scotland.
So how can individuals contribute to the conservation of invertebrates?
I mean, this is also the fantastic thing about it, because if you ask how can individuals support a panda, well, you can give money to an organisation that's doing things about pandas is probably the only answer, because we can't do anything in our own space. We as individuals can do stuff in our own space to help invertebrates, and that's the great thing about it. Even if you only live in a flat with no garden, if you can put a window box up and plant some of the right plants, and I always say, if you're going to do that, plant something like herbs, but let them flower, because flowering herbs are brilliant for pollinators, but you've also got the advantage you can lean out the window and pick some and put them in your cooking. So it's a win-win situation, really worthwhile doing. And what you're doing effectively, if you do that, is it's like creating the equivalent of a motorway service station. It's somewhere where a pollinator can pop in and refuel. And instead of perhaps only being able to go half a kilometre, it can now perhaps travel a kilometre between places. So just by doing that, you're enhancing it. And of course, you can support a charity that works on this. So someone like Buglife, and we'd love you to get involved in supporting, or even better, become a member of Buglife, become a regular supporter, and learn about other things you can do in whatever small space you've got to do things, or at your workspace or at your school.
What is your opinion about insects becoming a new source of protein?
We actually feel that it would be a good forward step, as long as this is done in a responsible way. What we wouldn't want to see is mass wild harvesting of insect species, and particularly of rare species for this purpose. But if you've got captive breeding of insects to make foodstuffs, it's obviously going to be better for the planet, because there's far less methane going out. It's also going to be taking up far less land for agriculture, because you can basically do it in a warehouse and produce huge amounts of protein, compared to the vast tracts of land at the moment that are spoilt as areas for wildlife because they have to be intensively grazed. So it's a really, really good thing to do, and also it would help people start to value insects and the roles that they play, because at the moment most people, I think, understand pollination, and that's important, but most of those other fantastic services that insects carry out, people don't appreciate. If they became a regular food substance, hopefully they would appreciate them more, in the way that people probably don't appreciate things like scampi, which is this major food substance around the world. And indeed, globally speaking, there is more weight of invertebrate eaten than there is weight of beef and sheep, etc., etc. It's just here in the Western world we've become acclimatized to eating these other things, and I think it would be a good thing if we change that. That's not to say people shouldn't necessarily become vegetarian, and I know vegetarians wouldn't eat insects, but if you are going to eat meat, then insects is a better option for the planet.
Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Lovely talking to you as well, and look forward to seeing the podcast.